Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Conversations. I'm very pleased today to have as my guest Ayaan Hirsi Ali, author of several best-selling books. The first one I remember reading and being very influenced by, Infidel, and then Nomad, and now Heretic, I think. And
Yeah.
you're a fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center and at the American Enterprise Institute. So thank you for joining me here. And
Thank you for having me.
No,
it's
it's
great
great.
to see you, Bill.
it's good to see you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Maybe we could begin with, we're speaking a week after the attack in San Bernardino in early December, and one of the two attackers was a Muslim woman. And I don't take this in the wrong way, but I thought of you because one of the most interesting parts of your book is that how you were radicalized, I guess it's the way we now say it, as a younger woman, really, as a teenager, and became for a while a pretty pious and, I guess, as I say, we would say radicalized almost Muslim. And so everyone knows, I think people know about your subsequent life and very courageous and distinguished career, but it might be worth, in light of what has just happened, how does it happen? I mean, what happened to you, and what conclusions did you draw from your own experience?
Well, I think there are two things that I'd like to talk about in depth on that. One is we should not be politically correct about the fact that there is something within Islam, an ideology that is appealing, that's familiar, and that people who are born into Islam, not everyone, but a lot of us feel attracted to. And initially it's peaceful, and initially it's a good thing. And the second thing is to talk about my experience. And I'll say this, and I've said it before, the most relevant part of my biography at all is this knowing how easily as an individual you can really be taken in with what I now call a totalitarian ideology that's embedded in the religion of my parents. So I was 15 or 16 years old. I was in secondary school, and I think you call that high school here.
Yes.
And one,
And this
is in Nairobi, Kenya.
So you
yeah,
come from...
Yeah, I went to Muslim girls' secondary school.
Right.
And in that school, like many other schools, we had what we call the Islamic Religious Education Hour, IRE. And in previous classes, the class was taught pretty much the way one would teach a history class. You got to know, Muhammad founded the religion this year, and then a few years later this happened, and a few years later that happened, all the way to the present. But then this woman comes into our class. She asked us to call her Sister Aziza, which is very different from what we called the other teachers, which was always Mr. or Mrs. So instead of calling her Miss Aziza because she wasn't married, she asked us to call her Sister Aziza. And she gathered us, those of us who volunteered to go take the IRE class, and said, how many of you here are Muslims? Which is, of course, a very interesting question when we looked around and thought, it is the IRE class. It's the Islamic Religious Education class. We're all Muslim. And she took us in a very gentle, and I would say in a very charismatic way, appealed to our intellect, which is different from how I was used to learning religion at that point. On Saturdays and Sundays, my mother sent us to Quran school. And the Quran was drummed into us, literally, and we had to recite it as loudly as possible and copy it from the Quran and onto something, and then we had to be beaten if we didn't do what the teacher told us, and if we didn't just recite what we had learned by rote, or what we had.
Your family was religious?
My family was religious, but I think
you yourself at that point were...
I was just probably
just going along.
Going along. We didn't really think that much about religion because I come from a family and a context where at that point everybody around me was Muslim. And so you don't ask yourselves, am I a Muslim or am I not a Muslim? And that's just how religion is taught at that point. Except, and here is this new development, this female teacher says, are you a Muslim? We say we are. And she starts to take us and she makes us aware of the fact that even though we identify ourselves as Muslim, we were in fact not doing very much about it, and that we were indistinguishable from the non-Muslim students in school. We didn't cover our hair. She asked, when was the last time you prayed? I didn't remember the last time I prayed. Do you associate with the other? Do you have Christians as your friends? We didn't have Jews in my school. They were Christians. And we would say yes. So all of these, she made us aware of the fact that the answers to all of these questions were wrong. And so then we started becoming more pious, trying to observe as much as possible our Islamic obligations, try to pray 5 times a day, all 5 of them. Now, in a modern context and as a teenager, that's extremely difficult. During the month of Ramadan, try to fast all 30 days, but when you're menstruating, there are 5 days you're not allowed to, but then you have to repay those. And then all the rest of it, distance yourself from the unbelievers. I remember the way that we would pray. We would pray before this influence, and when you're done praying, you look to your right and you look to your left and you jump up and you go and do something, you get on with the rest of the day. That changed because now we had to sit back and start the supplication prayer, and it always ended with, please destroy the Jews, please destroy Israel. Now, in the United States of America and in Israel and in the Middle East, that might make sense to people. But I'm in Nairobi, Kenya, never seen a Jewish person in my life, and know at that point nothing about Israel. So in many ways, when I reflect back on that time, I think, okay, what I experienced that point as becoming more pious and more observant is what we've now come to call radicalization and extremism and so on and so forth. And that is where we are.
And this takes place in a school that's not a madras the way we hear about. And I mean, it's not an Islamic school. It's just a secondary school?
At that point, it was a secondary school,
sort of secondary school for...
Most of my teachers were Christian or Hindu, or, we didn't even know if you came from the Indian subcontinent, some of them called themselves Bora. That to me as just meant, you're from India. Religion was there. People were religious, but it wasn't your only identity.
Right.
So at that point, when I'm 16 years old and I'm going to that school, I am a Somali. When I'm among Somalis, I'm of the sub-clan Darod. When Somalis are together, they don't refer to each other as Somalis. It's the clan identity that is uppermost. And then there were students from Yemen, from Pakistan, Kenyan students, and you had all of these identities. Your religion wasn't the one identity. Right. And that is one thing that if we talk about the process of what we now call radicalization, that you see a process where individuals are putting on a religious identity. It's all about being a Muslim. You shed the rest of it, or you downplay the rest of it, and you try to make everybody else as pious as yourself. And this would be, I would say, looking back on San Bernardino, the telltale signs. It's some of these changes that the family, the friends, the close circle of relatives should have observed. And here is probably where it gets a little difficult. If indeed they did, how much of it did they agree with? And that makes it very, very difficult to address Islamic extremism and combat it. But we have to anyway.
And just so psychologically, now that how long did this stage go, first of all?
Well, so there are two levels. It's on a personal level, my own, how I changed personally, and how my neighborhood and my school and the area around me changed. So if I look back to Nairobi and perhaps even Somalia, because we were embedded within the Somali expatriate community in Kenya, there was, again, like I said, people were religious, but just to describe a street scene, men and women mixed. And, we went to weddings where men and women mixed. It was a traditional dress, but for women it was very colorful. Women wore perfume. They wore jewelry. They tried to look as attractive as possible. And in fact, that was something that one had to be proud of. As a woman, you go out and you try to be as attractive as possible. And if I now look to those same neighborhoods and same streets, I see that change. And I think I was there at the early stages where now all the women are covered. They try to look as unattractive as possible. There is this attempt at separating men from women. And so this, on a personal level, I did it because, my teacher was telling me, and she wasn't the only one. Again, then even the weekend Quran classes changed. They were taken over by what we now call extremists, but we thought of them as pious and pure Muslims. And the message I was getting personally was, you cannot carry on behaving the way you're behaving and remain a Muslim. So then I started to cover, and so I, changed along with the street and with the neighborhood. Interestingly, do not ask questions. So as a teenager, you are at that, phase in your life when you start to ask questions of, why am I here? What is the point of this life?
Right, yeah.
What's the difference between right and wrong? And the answers we were getting from these super pious, let me call it new Islam. It's not a new Islam, it was our Islam, but becoming, aware of what our religion says is the answers are in the Quran, and they're in and the Prophet Muhammad has laid it all out there. So instead of asking why and when and why did Muhammad say that and why does God want this, I was concerned about, obviously, suddenly how I didn't have equal rights with my brother or the men around me. But the rights as a woman that we had became even less and less and less. We had to submit more than they did. We were the ones who were supposed to cover up and stay away from public, the public square. And so then you say, but why does Allah want that? And that wasn't only frowned upon, it was punished as being sinful. And, I was told, if I asked these questions by both of those teachers, that I had to be very careful not to allow the shaitan or Satan into my thoughts. So critical thinking is one thing that I think, and it's the first step, but it's one thing that these guys fear. It's the one thing that they fear the most, and it's the one thing that we haven't applied to them, unfortunately.
And how long did you become pious, if that's the right word? Or
pious and observant. I became, instead of being a passive Muslim, I became an active observant, or actively observant Muslim. This lasted until I went to the Netherlands. And I do remember in the late 1980s, 1989, 1990, kind of having problems with, my worldview became narrower and narrower and narrower. And it was constant worship, constant references to the Prophet Muhammad, and constant references to the Quran. It was as if you couldn't go from here to there without first consulting a holy book that was written in the 7th century. And I think what happened to me is I went through a process of cognitive dissonance, where I was having question marks pop up in my head about the rightfulness of this change, but I didn't dare ask those questions. And for me, and this is again on reflection, and I'm now about 19 or 20 years old, I'm terrified of hellfire. And it is the use of the tool hellfire that makes it incredibly difficult, if you're a Muslim, to come out of this and say, I don't buy into this, or even just start the conversation about questions. When I left Kenya and went to the Netherlands, and I was in the Netherlands, and my first port of arrival into Europe, into the West, was in Germany. And the physical environment was so radically different from what I was used to. And the longer I stayed and the more I started to have friendships with native Dutch people, the more I liked what I saw. And the more I liked what I saw, the more I wanted to understand where all this came from. I come to the Netherlands, I'm from Somalia, and I'm not the only one. There are all these people coming from all over the world asking for asylum. And, you know, we were treated in the most humane way. Again, I remember the scene of when I first asked for asylum in the Netherlands. I'm asked to sit down by an agent behind a locket. And then a man in uniform comes toward me, and I think this is the end of it. He's going to arrest me, because that's exactly how life was in Kenya and in Ethiopia. And, you know, you feared people in uniform. You feared the state. And this guy comes to me and asks me whether I'd like a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And it's this kind of thing that we take it for granted now, and I'll never take it for granted, but a lot of people take it for granted, where I think you can't, you shouldn't, you mustn't. It hasn't always been like this. But in any case, my environment is radically different from what I was used to. And I want to understand it. And 2.5 years into my residence in the Netherlands, I apply for a place at the Leiden University. And as a very grateful graduate of that university, I want to say what they taught me there was how to think. And they encouraged critical thinking. I wasn't taught much about Islam. I don't think I went there from 1995 to 2000. And I did a master's in political science. Very little, if anything, came about Islam. It didn't really come up that much. Right. And so 9/11 it took everyone by surprise. But looking back, what I do remember is, you know, my professor's insistence on not only having us exposed to all of these ideas and this history of politics and power, and, you know, introduction to sociology, to history, introduction to, and in this case, European history is what they sort of shortened it to. But you're exposed to all of these ideas and theories. But the insistence of my professors that this was not a science, but a theory. Everything is a hypothesis. And we had to not only read the original works of the people who came up with the theories, but their critics as well. And then we were sent off to think critically of the critics and maybe come up with an original idea that is an improvement on what was already in place. And it is this constant exercise in critical thinking that I think ultimately, and I graduated just before 9/11. I graduated in September of 2000. I think it is those 5 years that helped me when 9/11 happened. And at the time I was a believing Muslim, not a practicing Muslim, but a believing Muslim. When I was confronted with the atrocity of the attacks in New York and Washington, D.C., I couldn't say to myself, this has nothing to do with my religion. And I think it was those 5 years in Leiden that got me to that place where I could have an honest conversation with myself first about my faith and about my morality and about my background and what I shared with those 19 men. And that, in fact, if I had continued on the path that Sister Aziza had put me on, I might have been one of them, if not in that sensational way that they did. You know, hijacking airlines isn't what I'm talking about, but something like what the woman in San Bernardino, Tashfin Malik, did. I would have been a willing executioner of jihad if I had stayed on the path that Sister Aziza had put me on.
No, and that's what's chilling about this in a way is one wonders, well, what about the people you came to the Netherlands for? You had to come really for other reasons, but if, as you say, if you'd stayed there and hadn't perhaps had, maybe you would have in any case turned against it. I don't know, or met people who would have raised questions or encountered a book or not. But that's what. But there are all these hundreds of millions of people who aren't going to come to study at Leiden University, and how does one get them out of the charismatic appeal, and also say a little more about the appeal, because I think that's something we in the West underestimate, where most Westerners are pretty secular. Some of them are personally religious, but not. But used to living in a secular world. Let's put it that way, and very hard, I think, to understand how. It just seems like a sickness almost if you get seduced into this, but I think that misses the depth of the appeal somehow, and it's often, in fact, some of the most impressive people who can get attracted to this.
Attracted to it, yeah, and also very, very smart people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think first it starts with familiarity. It is the people we've now come to call Islamic extremists do not bring anything new. They build on what you already have. If my parents taught me that everything in the Quran is true, that it's the true word of God, that we should try and, as much as possible, do what the Prophet Muhammad told us to do. And that's how they start the conversation. I'm not bringing anything new. I'm not asking you to worship me. I'm just asking you to worship Allah. And how do I know that? It's in the Quran. So they start with what you already know. It's empowering, because once you go down this path of I'm only going to consult scripture, you get these black and white answers to very complex questions. And it may be complex questions of identity, or complex questions of power. What can I do about it? There's a lot of talk about injustice, and there's a lot of insistence on injustice. And so if you want to make a world that's unjust, you want to achieve justice, what do you do about it? So you get very clear instructions on what you should do and what you may not do. There is the halal and the haram. If you want to be a good person, and I think most human beings want to be good people, you get this manual of this is what is forbidden. And I want to give you just a list of what's forbidden. It's forbidden for men and women to mix because it's sinful. Therefore, for instance, all recreational activities that we in the West take for granted are forbidden. Going to the cinema, going out to dance, going to cafes and restaurants, going to a soccer match together, or any other kind of sports engagement where men and women would mix. All of this is portrayed as extremely sinful. And because you do not want to sin, you may not, waste your time. Instead of worshiping God and singing his praises, you're now you're using that time to commit a sin. And then they go on and on about the mixing of the genders, the mixing of the sexes. So when something like Paris happened, the November 13 attacks in Paris, and the places that they attacked, those are really consistent with what is drummed into the ears of a lot of Muslims who may not act on it, but we're told it's sinful. What's halal? What's allowed for you to do? Then you get a list of things that you may engage in. And then there's a gray area. And there is, I'm not telling you, libraries full of jurisprudence on discussions about that gray area. So in the 21st century, talking about this, you would say this is just neurosis taken to an extreme. But the tragedy is we can't really laugh about it, because it is now being taught to young people who the age at which this is being taught is getting younger and younger. And the more and more people for whom it is not only appealing, but who have digested it and taken it on and are spreading it among their peers, is much larger. So the appeal is, it's familiar, it is your religion, it is, and it's exciting, it's empowering, it's thrilling. If you're a young man and you live here or you live in Europe, and you have to get a job, and you have to commute to work 5 days a week. Right. And you're told, well, in terms of, it's a material world, you're working to have a home and a car and a wife and children, and you ask yourself, is that it? Whereas, look at what the Islamic State is doing. They're offering you everything all at once.
I suppose the jihad aspect of Islam, as I was thinking as you spoke, there are very Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, for whom there's quite a lot of separation of the sexes, and of course a huge amount of time spent studying obscure jurisprudential works. Yeah. But on the whole, there are exceptions. these people become somewhat just withdrawn from the world and inwardly focused on their communities, and
Yeah.
the same is true of some Christian sects and denominations. I think maybe what makes Islam a little different, I mean, and there are aspects of that, and there are parts of Islam that have that character too, I think.
Yes.
But I guess the sort of jihad side of Islam
Yeah.
seems to give those who get pulled in that direction the potential of,
Yeah.
fulfilling their religious views, their duties as they see them, not just by, studying 12 hours a day, which which is sort of the more.
Yeah, which is the more sort of harmless.
Yes.
So researchers, the work of researchers on, they don't call it radical Islam, or they try not to call it radical Islam. They call it Salafis and Salafism, and they have these distinctions between the quietist Salafis, who would behave like the Jewish group you described, spend most of their hours worshipping, basically, and don't harm other people. And so there are the quietists, and then there's a second subset of people in this jargon called the political activist Salafis. They do actually try to take steps to take over the state, but in a non-violent way. And then the jihadists. The trouble, I think, what makes Islam probably different from the other religions is politics and religion have never been separated. So it's if you're a Salafi and you're a quietist Salafi, it doesn't mean that you are apolitical. You see, I personally prefer the terms Medina, Makkah, and reformers. But let's just adopt, the terms and the terminology that we
your
have.
term. You explain your terms. That's
So in heretic, I try to distinguish between Muslims who I think are peaceful and apolitical and just are really not in the least a threat to anyone. And in fact, in many ways, they become the victims of Islamic extremism. And when I reflect on how they worship and what parts of their religion they make salient for themselves, it is the period of Muhammad in Mecca, when he was basically engaged only in teaching and he had a spiritual message. And then they try to ignore everything else that happened later in Medina. But when he goes to Medina 10 years after the founding of Islam, he becomes a militiaman. He becomes a legislator. He's a warrior. And his message is is really what we would now call totalitarian. And Muslims who like that part of Islam and who want to go back to that period are the ones that my fellow researchers call Salafis, or they've settled for the term Salafis. I would rather call them Medina Muslims, because what the Medina Muslims, whether they are non-violent or violent, whether they're active or apathetic, what they aspire to is, divine law, society governed by Allah. And according to the Sharia law, the Quran is basically the constitution. So an entity like the Muslim Brotherhood, I would put that under the label Medina Muslims. And I know that recently they've become gradualist and they've decided to participate through the political system. But the violent jihadis are also Medina Muslims. So the Islamic State is also part. Their end game is the same. The objective is the same. They disagree on the means to get to that objective. So again, that is what makes Islam different from other religions. And I think in other religions, believers have accepted, and there's always a fringe, of course, but they've largely accepted not only the separation of religion from politics, but also the order of nation states that we have, the world order that was established under U.S. leadership since 1945. And Muslim extremists reject that world order. And so it's not only about trying to prevent the next terrorist attack here locally. Islamic extremism, or the Medina Muslims, have a very local and then very regional and global agenda. And these agendas are sometimes linked, and sometimes these groups are operating separately and are sometimes even enemies of one another. For instance, the government of Saudi Arabia, the biggest sponsor of Islamic extremism, is opposed to the Islamic State. There are these internal contradictions. Right. But the message itself, the core message is the same. And I think the only way out of this crisis, civilizational crisis that Islam is undergoing, is to reform the religion.
Yeah, I mean, another way people sometimes put it is Judaism is also a religion of law, and that's why Islam got that from Judaism, really, a quite total law, maybe not. But Judaism is not, on the whole, I mean, individual Jews can be aggressive, where Israel can take territory, from a neighboring state if people want to accuse it of that. But it's not, there's no commission, there's no mandate, there's no command to convert other people, and in fact the expectation in the Hebrew Bible is that Jews will always be one people among many. So there's not that kind of imperialism, you might say,
yes,
that Islam has. Christianity is universal, so it has a kind of, you might say, imperial mission, but it's mostly, and not always in history, otherworldly, so it's supposed to, and Islam is combined in a certain way, the two in a way that gives it the most potential. I mean, of course, it's why it was so unbelievably successful, presumably, for the first few centuries.
Yes.
I mean, no religion has ever done what Islam did, really, conquer a huge amount of them from nowhere.
Come from nowhere and conquer all of these empires and establish an empire, and was an empire only until, less than 200 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And with Christianity, I think Christianity has also gone through a period.
And it had then the Reformation.
Yeah, the Reformation, and it's had its violent past. I mean, if you talk about Christianity in Europe, it's very different from Christianity in the U.S. And so no one is denying that there are religious texts and other religions have their violent elements. But what makes 21st century Islam unique and different from other religions is that this separation of politics from religion hasn't occurred, and violence and the idea of violence, so in other words, the idea of jihad, it hasn't been put to rest. And that has to happen. What also Medina Muslims, what they do is they advertise and they instruct their children and they indoctrinate young people with an idea that makes life after death more attractive. And so they turn Islam into a cult of death. Even when they are not violent. So if you keep teaching your children, there's no need for recreation here. There's no need to have pleasure here. Just spend as many hours as possible trying to get as many points as you can, so you'll be rewarded when you die. And after the day of judgment, you inadvertently create a cult of death. Medina Muslims have also cultivated, and it's a very basic concept within Islam. It's called commanding right and forbidding wrong. And maybe you could call that jihad light. But one of the reasons why, again, if we look at the San Bernardino case and the cases in Paris, all of these jihadist terrorist attacks that are unfolding that we're seeing, there's this long process. How come we haven't seen it? How come we couldn't stop it? Well, if your friend and your neighbor and your loved one is commanding right and forbidding wrong, why would you report them to the police? You are the one who's, because everybody believes in this whole thing about being rewarded and punished for what you do and fail to do in life after death. So if you also care about your life after death, and you yourself are not violent, but turning your brother in, or turning someone who is actually doing something about that in to the authorities, is going to compromise your place in heaven. So it gets very, very complex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about Europe and about America, but just one more sort of more psychological question almost. I mean, what about, so I think for Americans, understanding that a woman who grew up in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia and lived in that world, the way in which you could go be radicalized, let's just say, call it that, is sort of one can understand that. It's more mystifying when you have then her husband, in this case, who grew up in America. I think he was born in America. And here he is in the same, going to a public high school, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think he went to a segregated,
No.
Islamic school. He works for the U.S. government, for the state government, or a county government, I guess.
Yeah.
Worked for them, and that is I think more mystifying in a way to people, that this America, it seems to Americans like such a powerful cultural thing. How could someone so thoroughly reject it?
And I think it shouldn't be mystifying, because the infrastructure of indoctrination that I described in Nairobi is also here. There are Islamic centers here, mosques, manifestos, pamphlets, publishing houses, and a myriad organizations all pushing an Islamist agenda. That's all here in America. And I think in a way the fact that we are mystified speaks maybe a little bit to our arrogance.
Yeah.
The fact that we think people come from somewhere else and all of these wonderful things will just rub off on them. And it was really painful to watch the shock of the colleagues of this guy, Said Farouk. They threw him a baby shower. They interacted with him on a daily basis. The neighbor who said, I knew there was something that wasn't right, but I couldn't allow myself to think that way because I'm not bigoted. And to think that if you spot something and your gut feeling, if that were a white man, let's say he was a white supremacist, and she saw these boxes coming, she definitely would have called the FBI. So in many ways, I think we are not mystified because we can't know what's going on. I think we are in a way mystified because we don't want to know. We've been conditioned to think that if we hold people of color and other religions and the religions of people of color to the same standards that we hold ourselves, that we're bigoted.
But I also think, as you say, we're arrogant and optimistic in the sense that we assume that people came from so many different places and cultures to the United States and from so many different backgrounds within the United States, and they mostly, of course, there were individual incidents and some bumps in the road, but people have all become, a melting pot, as we say, and and it's striking how, I guess that's the question. What you're saying there is that there's I don't know if would there be more of a melting pot if there weren't these institutions that were dragging people back,
Dragging back. I think these institutions are taking advantage of the fact that there is this relativism and cultural relativism and the idea of multiculturalism, and that there is this political correctness. I don't think that the Islamist agents want that they've imposed political correctness on us. What they have found is a relativist, politically correct society that is an open society and a free society. And they have taken advantage. They're exploiting these advantages, but they haven't made us do it. And so it is, I think, our responsibility to undo that, And it's becoming very difficult. I'm now, seeing the same conversations here in the U.S. that I was used to in Europe, where there's this notion of, multiculturalism and all groups are the same, and, all cultures are the same, and all religions are equal. And in a way, you are punished by the mainstream if you challenge that. If you say, but cultures are not equal, it's almost like it's now become the liberal blasphemy to say cultures are not equal and religions are not equal, and that it's dangerous actually to think this, because then you become complacent and you forget that liberalism is a relatively new idea. And liberal societies are relatively new. And as Karl Popper put it, the open society has enemies and will forever have enemies, because there are people who just hate civilization. And that's not because they are Muslim or they are not Muslim. It has nothing to do with that. The totalitarian challenge of the day is Islamic totalitarianism. But I hope we defeat that. But once we defeat that, there's going to be some other totalitarianism. So the open society is going to be challenged. And the only way to maintain it and to preserve it is by having a polity that's educated and that doesn't entertain these nonsensical ideas, nonsensical and dangerous, such as multiculturalism and all cultures and all religions are equal. That is not relativist.
What can we do given where we are now? What American policies are sensible? What are foolish? What attitudes need to be changed? I mean, what would you?
Yeah, where do I start,
if the
right?
president called you up, which
Yeah.
maybe the next president will call you up and ask,
Hopefully, yeah. I think we should, again, we're an open liberal society, and so we should call a spade a spade. If we don't diagnose problems properly, then we won't be able to develop policies that address them effectively. We're talking about Islam here. We're talking about a religion and a civilization with followers. It's one in every 5 people is a Muslim on the planet. It has a religious dimension and it has a political dimension, and it also has other dimensions. We have problems with the political dimension of Islam, the mixing of politics and religion. And even when you accept that and you can speak openly about it, we understand, that there is the development of this political Islam into an ideology. There are the agents who organize themselves to push that agenda, and there are resources. And we know that these resources come from private persons, but they also come from nation states, like Saudi Arabia explicitly, Kuwait, Qatar. And so on a foreign policy level, again, don't just focus on violent extremism, because that's when things get out of hand. But if you take this whole process where you say, okay, let's start with the non-violent ideas and who's pushing the ideas and the resources, you are going to have all of these elements in your foreign and domestic policy. And that way you don't only rely on surveillance and military means. We as a country can choose who we let into the United States and who we don't. And I think we would have to make it conditional for people that we allow in, that they explicitly reject that political dimension of Islam. We have to spell out what it is that they need to reject and what it is that they need to accept. In order to do that, and I don't know if that is something that a politician can do, because we are in, this idea of relativism and political correctness. That is something that it is everywhere. It's on campuses. It is in the media, in the mainstream media, and of course it is in politics. So that is, this self-censorship that we've imposed on ourselves. That's something that we have to address, to deal with. I believe that America is exceptional, that America should lead the world, and if we don't have American leadership, the world is going to become an ever more dangerous place. And so we should be proud of articulating exactly what it is that makes the idea of America so exceptional and superior to the idea of political Islam and other bad ideas in history. Again, to do that, we have to shed this political correctness that we have, and also not have these conversations about if you start talking seriously about some of the threats we face, you're called extreme right wing. We just engage in this name calling, and it's a form of intellectual poverty, again self-imposed.
I mean, it sounds as if the multiculturalism you think is really, which seems to, who are we to say what kind of Islam people should have, or who we shouldn't discriminate among the people we admit from different countries, I suppose. I guess we do discriminate against maybe people with criminal records or whatever, but that's about all.
We discriminate all the time. We profile all the time. How can we tell someone, why do we have all these airports and airline conditions? I mean, we do take a lot of steps, and we've been safe largely since 9/11 because we do take these steps. My problem with, say, our government is because we refuse to call the problem by its name, we tie our hands and we limit ourselves to the most drastic of policies, which is exclusively military and exclusively, surveillance. And so, if and I hope you agree with me, if you believe that, ideas shape minds, we're not fighting on the battlefield of ideas, when in fact we have a superior idea. The idea of America and the content of the Constitution of America is so much more superior to everything in the Quran. We should be able to say this explicitly. If there's somebody here in our mosques and Muslim centers taking our American Muslim audiences and trying to indoctrinate them with the idea that Sharia law is superior to the idea of America, we should be able to have a rebuttal ready.
Yeah, that doesn't have to be government, I suppose, but at least...
It doesn't, you don't have to...
But no one wants to be impolite, and so people don't say
Yeah.
what you've just said, and they don't make the case for liberal democracy, in a sense, and
If we
they
don't
allow illiberal organizations to flourish
Yeah.
in the middle of a liberal democracy. I mean,
And when we do that, then we end up leaving that extremely important space, that, the arena of ideas. We leave it to the extremists. On the one hand, the Islamic extremists, on the other hand, others who respond to that. And again, in the context of Europe, I'm sure you've been following the rise of radical right-wing parties, political parties. And the segments of the European populations with substantial, Muslims living among them, who are alarmed by Islam, they have only one place to go now, and it is these extreme right-wing parties, because the established parties, because of this political correctness, they simply refuse to address it. And we are seeing things like that developing here in the United States, where, Americans who are alarmed by Islamic extremists are now ready to give their vote to anti-establishment figures who at least say what they think. So we're being punished for that political correctness, and it's coming from the population. And I think it's very, very dangerous to let this go out of hand.
yeah, both the backlash can get out of hand, and also
Yeah.
I feel bad, for the young Muslim Americans growing up in, let's say, fairly pro-American kind of families with the peaceful worship of the Quran. They do or they don't worship, whatever, that's their own decision. How much they pray, that's their own decision. But then it seems to me the refusal to sort of draw lines leaves them much more susceptible to being recruited by the more activist and
by the more activists. So there is some good news. I know we're taping it today, and I don't know when you're going to air it, so I don't know if I say today.
It doesn't matter.
Today, I don't know what the date is, but
December, early December.
Yeah, in early December, we have a group of American Muslims who launched, and some of them are European, they launched Muslim reform. So they're saying we are Muslims for reform. They're not denying that there's a problem within Islam. And I think they are the people that our president should be talking to. And some of these names are prominent names, like Zuhdi Jasser, Asra Nomani. These are individuals who grew up in America, who are Americanized in every way possible, and yet to identify themselves as Muslim because they adhere to the faith dimension of Islam and not the political dimension. And they should be the people whom we should not only be talking to, but we should also be in many ways giving them the resources to reach out and to compete with the infrastructure of Islamist indoctrination that's already well established for the hearts and minds of Muslims who live here, whether they're citizens or residents or whatever, or asylum seekers, or you name it. And it's just a way of reaching these people and telling them, listen, the guy who just told you that Sharia law is better than American law, you need to ask him why everywhere where Sharia law is established, why human rights are violated and the rights of women robbed, and where there are beheadings and amputations, why all this violence. That is Sharia law. This is America. You came to America in search of a better life, and life here on earth is much better than life after death, which none of us really come back as witnesses to report from what happens afterwards. So it is and I think this sounds very simplistic, but it's conversations like this that you have in the classroom, that you have in the neighborhood, that you have in the places on the internet where young Muslim people frequent. That is where you can generate these question marks, like the one that popped up in my head, And I know that those question marks are there. And I think what we need to do is exploit that dissonance between, I want to ask this question, why should I only obey? And, the merits of the Prophet Muhammad, is it really good to follow in his example all the time? These are the questions that the reformers are asking already. And any young Muslim who allows himself or allows herself to think about these things always gets these questions. All we need to do is just give them a helping hand.
So in that respect, the multiculturalism, the political correctness, the deference in a way to the established organizations, the Islamist organizations, is not just neutral, but it actually makes things worse in a way, right? I mean, it legitimates those organizations as the ones that speak for Islam.
As the ones that speak for Islam, yeah. I have a piece of paper here that I think you should take with you, because I asked my researcher, can you please, because it's public knowledge, can you please find out who our president talks to when he says that he's reaching out to Muslims? And this is organized Islamist lobby, and they have an Islamist agenda. In the long term, they say this, and this is not a secret, they say this quite openly in their own letters, and they would like to Islamize America. So why is our president talking to this group and not talk to the groups who are very serious about and really sincere about finding a true balance between being an American and a Muslim?
Yeah, well, why? I don't know. What's the answer?
Yeah, so that means, maybe the next president. I think because these groups are organized and well-funded and articulate, and they have media arms. They've completely studied how things work in America, and then they're applying that. And I think that our president, who is a very busy man, doesn't...
Right.
Yeah, what am I supposed to say that? I think he's well-meaning, like my fellow... Europeans, when I was in Holland, were all very well-meaning, but there's a laziness, I have to say, about just not wanting. Okay, they are organized. They say they speak for Islam. I'll take.
Don't you think a little bit as we can buy them? If they feel that they're
and
being
they can,
included, they'll moderate maybe, or they won't be as much violence.
And then also to say they'll also be able to mobilize people who will vote. There are all kinds of reasons why politicians sometimes, I think sometimes it's just a blind spot, but sometimes there are reasons why people don't want to see what is in front of them.
How about the fact, the Bin Laden famously said, in the Middle East at least, the people follow the strong horse, not the weak horse. And I do think when Europe lets you be driven out of Europe, and when we allow ourselves, as a country, this is very different, recede before threats in the Middle East and elsewhere, and ISIS looks like it's winning.
Yeah.
That must have an effect here at home too, I think the whole thing does reinforce that this is the wave of the future, that the West is weak, and so forth.
Yeah, the Islamist agenda, the books and pamphlets and manifestos and websites that I have read in the United States, constantly call the United States, in terms of its spirituality, void and decadent and corrupt. And the answer is, and why have they become like this? Because they've rejected Tawheed, the oneness of Allah. They are not submitting to the real God who gives us strength. And then you have groups like ISIS emerging. And young people think, well, that's it. Islam is stronger, and it is going to rule the world. And again, we are in an open society, so we obviously have discussions. We are critical of our government, and we are critical of one another. And Islamists use that to say they're saying it themselves. Look at that. I mean, if Americans are saying we're racist, they must be racist.
Right.
If they're saying they're saying it themselves. And I don't think we can stop that, and we should stop it. I think we should have the free flow of ideas. They shouldn't determine how we speak to one another.
Right.
But we should also try and learn as much as we can about them as they have learned about us. What are they saying about us? What are they saying about America? Why is that resonating? And what can we do to target the same audiences and tell them the truth about ourselves?
You've lived in Europe and had both a wonderful experience there and then an awful experience, and now in America for a little over a decade, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm just curious what your thoughts about Europe and America, similar, contrast?
Well, again, I think if we stay with this topic, the most striking difference is in Europe you have political parties, right-wing political parties, but if you want to achieve something, you establish a political party. And here you have the candidates,
Right.
Individual candidates, so the system is different. I think in the United States we have we don't have only one mainstream media. We do have the mainstream media, but there's pushback from the Wall Street Journal, NRO, what
Right.
you guys do, Fox. So it's not a sort of deadening political correctness and that whole multiculturalism thing. And I call it just the social democratic burden. That's not here. I know that a lot of liberals here are very attracted to that and find European systems and European political correctness attractive, but it hasn't engulfed the whole nation. It hasn't brought us to the same paralysis, I think.
No.
Americans are also more optimistic. Americans are having kids.
Yeah.
And a lot of Europeans have decided to just let that go.
Right.
We have a very robust debate here about asylum seekers and refugees and Islam that the Europeans have been struggling to have for a long time. And sometimes there are these outbursts, and they do have them, but it's not really followed with policy. And I think probably the most important thing is Americans govern themselves, whereas a lot of Europeans have sort of ceded control to Brussels and Strasbourg.
Yeah, the self-government, I think, side of it is very important.
Yeah.
But it's one reason, I think, to fight back against attempts to turn America into a European-style centralized.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Now, the universities, you've dealt with them a lot in different ways.
Yeah.
How bad, I mean, do you worry that the universities are educating a younger generation of Americans to be more like the Europeans that you've discussed and described? And is it working or not working?
Not working, yeah. So when I'm on campuses, I'm surrounded by very young, very serious, brilliant students, hardworking, and not at all rioters. Sometimes you read about these students who are in constant riot mood, and you think, when do they study if they're rioting? I mean, it's only 3 years before you get your bachelor's, or your 4 years, and you know that the 4 years fly by.
Right.
But this whole thing about trigger warnings and, by the way, singling out minorities for what, in my view, is in itself racist and sexist and exclusivist. Why, as a black woman, as a black student, would it hurt me to read Mark Twain? Why do I need a trigger for that?
Right.
And it's this sort of nonsense, and I don't know if it's a fad and will pass, but it is definitely worrisome. Definitely worrisome. One difference between Europe and the U.S. Ivy League colleges are extremely expensive, and it's the parents who pay for that. And if you're paying $50,000-$60,000 a year for kids to be protected from ideas and from discussing ideas, I think that's a tragedy. I think it's a tragedy that all these presidents and faculty members are resigning Instead of, if I were president of any of these universities, whoever was out there protesting, I would say, I'll give you a suspension warning and then you will be expelled.
Right.
This is a place you come to study and learn and discuss and not riot. I saw the images in Dartmouth in the library. Those were really disturbing, where students walk through a library shouting obscenities and putting their middle finger in front of the faces of students. That is worrisome. I mean, that is not freedom of expression.
Right.
Yeah, because the university is an institution of learning, and bursting into a library behaving that way, those students should have been expelled.
Yeah, no, it is startling what's been happening in the last few months and a year or so in the universities, and it does seem to, I don't know, it's beyond political correctness now. Now it really is a dislike of freedom of speech and freedom of thought, I think, don't you think? I mean,
and I mean, am I becoming too American in the sense that I'm optimistic enough to say, well, the fact that all of that is now out in the open might lead to change, or should I really be more worried and more pessimistic?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. The universities are hard to change. I think normally in America, one can be optimistic. One reason why it pays to be optimistic is there are huge incentives and rewards for people to improve and to get things right. You know, so businesses are always self-correcting, creative destruction. And I think that's even true in policy. Politicians have to win elections. If things are going badly, in a way, the system has a certain impetus to self-correction built in. It's a fluid enough system that protesters will come up and win elections or whatever. Universities seem particularly
resistant to change.
Yes, because of tenure and because of the way they're set up and because no one challenges them and everyone's intimidated by them. I'd say I was struck myself that when I worked in education at the education department for Bill Bennett, K through 12 education you could challenge. I mean, there are big problems there for elementary and secondary education. But parents thought they had a right to say, I don't like that. You know, my kid shouldn't be learning that. Or why isn't my daughter learning math better? And if she isn't, I want to have the right to take her to a different school, or I'd like to go online and use, online education. Higher education people are so intimidated by, the degrees, and who am I to question Harvard or Brandeis or whatever, that I think it's much harder to get the normal self-corrective market forces, in a sense,
well, that is very sad then, because it is in universities where ultimately we educate our leaders, and this is to protect them from ideas and from debate and from discussion and from critical thinking. I don't think that's an education.
One last thing I want to ask about foreign policy. Just in this way, I mean, I guess I do think we were talking about Americans being mystified earlier about how someone who born here and grew up here could become a jihadist killer, but I also think the rise of ISIS and just the fact of it is so mind-boggling to Americans.
Yeah.
And they don't, it's sort of bewildering, a little paralyzing almost. What do we do? I mean, you can't just bomb them forever, and is this the wave of the future? I mean, no one thought 25 years ago, when it was supposed to be the end of history, that, that the 21st century would be a jihadist century or something. It's kind of, it seems crazy. This is modernity, enlightenment, prosperity. And I don't know, how strong, I guess I would say this is, how optimistic should be that if we had some strength from America and from other countries, a lot of this could go away pretty quickly, or how much is this a generational struggle, and how deeply embedded is it in the world of
Islam, But I say, we cannot really win the war on Islamic terrorism if we don't understand Islamic totalitarianism. And remember, we've been confronted with totalitarianisms previously, communism, and before that, National Socialism. And both ideologies claimed millions and millions and millions of lives. And we saw a great deal of war and destruction before they were defeated. And what for me is frustrating, especially if I look back on the last 14 years since 9/11, is having had that past and knowing a totalitarian ideology when we see it and how it manifests itself, why are we in such denial about it? Because it is all about the sooner we recognize, the sooner we can really deal with it. So we cannot defeat Islamic terrorism until we address Islamic totalitarianism. And that's the difficult part. And I really hope that we can find national unity on trying to understand that first component before we start throwing bombs and before we start slapping policies and money on different aspects of the problem. So we do have things going now. We have all kinds of policies, but they're incoherent. We've refused to call this by its name because we don't want to declare war on Islam, understandably. We don't want to declare war on 1.5 billion people, and we are not. But here is this totalitarian idea that doesn't have and doesn't make the same considerations. And it's preying first and foremost on Muslims.
Yeah.
And, we can't go back to and de-globalize the world. We are linked in many, many ways. And so I think ultimately the next leader, I really do not expect that President Obama is going to deal with Islamic totalitarianism. He's not going to call it by its name. He doesn't, even if he did, he doesn't have the time to change policies as radically as policies need to be changed now. But the next president and Congress and the American people should educate themselves on Islamic totalitarianism. What is the concept of the caliphate? What is Sharia law? What is jihad? How does this all come together? What is the political project? Who are the agents involved in this? These are questions you have to answer first before you can develop a coherent policy.
I hope we do develop such a policy.
Yeah.
Reading your books and it would be a great start for the next president, and we should make sure he does that, or he or she does that before he or she takes office. But anyway, thank you so much, Ayaan, for joining me today.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on Conversations.
Yeah.